Welcome back, all you beautiful people. Today, we're going to talk about deloads. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sexiest topic ever. Probably not. Probably not what you're thinking. But deloads are an important topic. I think it's well worth discussing it, discussing the research around when and how to best utilize deloads, because they've gotten a bad rap lately, with a lot of people saying they're a waste of time. Now, as long as I've been a part of fitness, or at least once I got past my bro bodybuilder stage, introduced to deloads. When I was more involved in strength and conditioning, it was told to me that it was a important thing to include in every program. And as such, I've been deloading regularly for most of my training experience. And I think it's a valuable thing to consider and discuss. Now, why do people deload? There's a few main reasons. Number one, improved recovery. If you're pushing hard in training, which hopefully you are, very important, you're going to feel beat up. Nothing mind-blowing there. And when you pull back on training, you're going to have more opportunity to recover. This can be something that can help when you're feeling beat up in your joints, if your muscles are really sore, and it gives you an opportunity to feel recovered for training. As such, you're going to decrease your fatigue. If you're pushing hard regularly, you're going to accumulate fatigue, and you need some way to alleviate that. You could have time off, but a better option might just be to deload. With that, when you reduce fatigue, you're going to increase your performance. So deloads are a great option to improve your ability to lift overall. Then we've got motivation. I've been training for a long time, and I love it. I absolutely just adore getting into the gym and smashing some weights. But there are times where I definitely lose motivation. And usually it's around a time where I've accumulated a lot of fatigue, and I just don't want to get in there anymore. And a deload can be a great choice where I can have an easier week, let my mind recover, and then want to get after it again. And then finally, enhance the responsiveness of training. When we look at how tissues are stimulated with a stimulus, redundant, but when you have a stimulus towards a tissue, when a tissue is challenged with a stimulus, how it responds. A factor is how long it's been exposed to that stimulus. The longer duration that it's exposed to, the decrease of how responsive it is. So when you pull back from challenging something, it's going to increase how responsive it is. So we get a benefit for your long-term adaptations by having a short-term decrease in challenge. Now, when we're looking at the general concept of training overall, we have progressive overload. You want to incrementally increase how much you challenge yourself. And with that, over time, you increase fatigue, you increase load, and that's good because you're going to make positive adaptations, but it can accumulate and be challenging. When we start to look at the fitness fatigue model, this is something that introduces the concept to where you're not ever going to be able to demonstrate your full performance capabilities because you're always going to have, or you're usually going to have a certain level of fatigue limiting you, and your full performance won't be demonstrated until you reduce that fatigue. And it's often going to have to come from either deloading or tapering in some meaningful way. So, what is a deload? Well, there's a huge range in how people choose to deload. Some people take a whole week off training. Other people have reduced volume. They might do a few less sets, a lot less sets, some variation within that. Other people opt for reduced intensity. Instead of pushing to failure, maybe they're a few reps away. Instead of going up to 85, 90%, whatever it may be for their volume, they're going to decrease it by 5 to 10 to 30%. Then we've got reduced frequency. Some people choose to cut their frequency in half and have a few extra rest days and keep everything else the same. And then you've got other individuals that do something called a pivot week, where they have different exercises than what they usually have. This is a little bit more common in certain powerlifting circles. Now, key thing is that what it's not. It's not an easy day. It's not a rest day. It's not an active recovery day. A true deload is where you're taking a meaningful period of time, so usually minimum a week, and having that reduction in loading so that way you're able to actually decrease fatigue and all those characteristics that we talked about. Now, how often do you deload? Again, huge range. In my experience, the most common one is every fourth week. You have 3 primary loading weeks, and then your fourth week, you pull back, recover, hit the fifth week hard, and keep building. And that really works reasonably well since we have a pretty standard week progression. You have 4 weeks to most months, etc. It's just a really comfortable format to do that. Not mandatory though. When I got involved in endurance, I started to see this 2 on, 1 off, where individuals have 2 loading weeks, then a maintenance week, which is essentially their deload, and that's a lot more common in the endurance world. But you also see this huge range where people will deload every 5 to 12 weeks. And then you've also got the situation where people do reactive deloads. And this is essentially when the person starts to feel beat up, feel like they've lost motivation, then they opt to deload at that point. Personally, I don't think that that's the best situation. I think that it's better to monitor what you tend to be able to handle for a number of weeks, adjust it to your situational preference, somewhere for most people 4 to 8 weeks, and have it consistent, because something that can be challenging if you're an individual who pushes really hard is to push really hard and get into a distinctly overreached state where you're actually quite overloaded and then try to just deload that off, and it usually doesn't work. And I've coached numerous athletes who have previously done this, where they pushed really hard for a reasonably long period of time and they're extremely fatigued or end up in an injured state, and instead if they just had regularly included some deloads, they could have managed that a lot better. So what does the research actually say on this? Well, the first thing to be clear is that there is not a ton of research directly on deloads. So we're going to have to infer to a degree from detraining research, taper research, and the minimalist research. And we will come back to deload specific research towards the end. So the first thing, we've got a research study from Ogasarwa et al. And what they did was they had 2 groups of individuals, one group that just trained consistently over 24 weeks, and then a second group that trained where they would do 6 weeks of loading, 3-week break, 6 weeks again, 3-week break, 6 weeks again. And when you look at the graph over to the side, this is cross-sectional area, so basically the size of the muscle. What you can notice is that during the training periods, there would be a spike and then a reduction, spike and reduction. And so they basically saw that during the deloads, and these deloads, to be clear, were no training. It wasn't reduced, it was just complete time off. They saw a drop in muscle size. So again, nothing mind-blowing. If you take time off, you're going to lose some of the benefits and adaptations that you've worked towards. But the positive is that when you get back to training, they come back reasonably quickly, that whole muscle memory thing. And you can see here that at the end of the 24 weeks, they had pretty similar results, which is encouraging. Now, when we start to look at the detraining research, I think we can get a little bit more of a stronger idea on some of this stuff. So one of the first ones that we're going to look at is the Deload et al. Study. What they had individuals do was train for 16 weeks, all the same program, and then they had 3 groups. One group that did nothing, one group that had dropped the volume of what they were doing previously down to 1/9 of what they were doing, and then a third group that did 1/3. And when they compared the results, you can see very clearly that the individuals that did nothing just had a steady decline. In contrast, the 2 groups that continued to train ended up maintaining some of their results. The individuals that did 1/3 of training basically maintained all of their results, which is really encouraging. Whereas the individuals that did 1/9, not as much. And they did this for a pretty substantial length of time. They did it for 32 weeks after the 16 weeks. So essentially 1/3, and you're able to maintain quite well. Now, a second study to look at, just to reinforce the same concept, was also looking at reducing training volume. And what they did was they had endurance athletes train for 10 weeks. Then they had them go through a detraining period for 15 weeks. And they either reduced their training by 1/3 or 2/3. And with the 1/3 reduction, they had no loss in endurance abilities. They measured time to exhaustion and VO2 max. Whereas in the group that did the 2/3 drop, they had a minor reduction, nothing of significance that I think anybody would walk away and be happy with. So essentially, dropping volume doesn't seem to be a huge detriment. So keep that in mind when we get to the practical section. Now, the same group of researchers, Hickson et al., did tons of awesome research to look at. Their other study that is very applicable here is where they had the same whole setup, but instead of changing volume, they changed intensity. So they had individuals run at 1/3 or 2/3 less of a pace, or decrease the cycling resistance that they utilized. And when they looked at these results, it still demonstrates benefit, but it's important to notice that they did have a reduction. I believe the 1/3 reduction had like a 21% decrease in time to exhaustion ability at the end of the 15-week detraining period, and the 2/3 had a 31%. So pretty significant drop-offs in performance. They were able to maintain considerably, given that they were doing the one group 1/3 of the amount of training, but it's still a pretty significant drop when you compare it to the intensity groups. Now, there's been some systematic reviews and meta-analyses looking at how much training needs to actually be done to make progress. And when we look at a study from Ralston et al., they found that individuals were able to generally maintain or actually improve their strength outputs with 5 sets targeting a direct movement. So generally looking at bench press, deadlifts, squats. They're looking at big, large main movements. So we know that if you're at least hitting roughly 5 sets towards the working movement, you're probably going to be able to retain a lot of your abilities. Second thing that we can draw from is this study from Steele 2022. So for anyone that hasn't seen the study, fantastic one. They had almost 15,000 participants, and they basically monitored these people as they trained over years and years and years. I think with some people going up to 7 years. In this group of individuals, all they did was they trained 1 time per week, and then they pushed it to failure. They had a handful of movements. I don't remember the specific number, like 4 to 6. And they had exercises like chest press, leg press, lat pull down. And they just pushed them as hard as they could. 1 set, failure, boom, repeat the next week. And they just did this continuously. And they saw improvements. And the important takeaway here is that when you look at this, again, this reinforces that intensity is huge. You can train with relatively minimal volume, but you need to make it intense. Now, the best study on deloads so far, you could make an argument, is the Coleman 2023 study, which has sparked all of these people now saying deloads are a waste of time and you shouldn't do them. What the study was, they took participants who trained, had them train for 9 total weeks with a 1-week break they had 2 groups, one group that trained 9 weeks entirely, and then one group that trained the 9 weeks except for had a 1-week break in the middle. Now, when they looked at the 2 groups, the group that trained and had the break in the center versus the group that trained continuously, they ended up with basically the same results for size. However, the group that trained and had the rest break in the center, or the deload, they actually had more muscle soreness, they had slightly less 1RM changes, and then they had less isometric maximal volitional ability. So from this, people have been saying, okay, deloads are a waste of time, you shouldn't do them. If you deload, you're going to be weaker, you're not going to gain as much size, and you're going to basically waste all your efforts. And that's just not true. First off, they had an entire week off. As we've been looking at from the previous research, that isn't the best choice. Taking a whole week off is not going to be the best option. If you're able to avoid that and instead going to, for instance, reduced volume but maintaining some level of intensity, you're going to be way better off. So, understandably, this has sparked a lot of controversy because people don't go and read the research. Now, if you'd like to read this one in particular, it has, it's open access, so you can go check it out. Now, how do you actually apply this? So first off, I think you need to ask yourself a few questions. I discussed the general frequency, so we'll come to that, or the timeline of every 4 to 8 weeks, but then how do you actually do that the week that you plan to deload? So, first thing, how experienced are you? If I'm a more novice trainee, I probably don't need to deload that much. I do think it's still worth doing, but you probably don't need to make it as much of a deload. It'll look a lot more like a pretty standard training week. In contrast, if you're a much more experienced trainee and you're able to have high outputs, you're able to have high force demands, all those things, you'd probably benefit more from having a greater reduction on your deload. Then, how hard do you train? Are you someone who digs super deep? You go to failure every set, you are just beating the crap out of yourself? Or are you a bit more on cruise mode? If you're more cruise mode, again, you probably don't need to deload very much. In contrast, if you're the person who pushes really hard, you'd probably benefit from pulling back a lot more. And then finally, how frequently do you train? If you only train 1 to 3 times per week, you probably don't have to change up your training that much on the deload. In contrast, if you're someone who's pushing a ton of volume and a much higher frequency, you'd likely benefit more from pulling back that week. So, first thing, pick your frequency. How often makes most sense for you? I know that for myself, generally, every 4 to 6 weeks is best. If I push beyond that, I usually feel like a bucket of crap. So I usually just put it every 4th week, easy breezy. And then I'll adjust the week that I deload, how much, by how I'm feeling. So then volume, ballpark, 10 to 70%. If you're not that grizzled, you're not training that much, all those kinds of things, minor decrease. Just a few sets off your main movements. Boom, done. Instead, if you're someone who's a lot more beat up, you're pushing really hard, take more sets off your main movements, take more sets off your accessories, and you're good. And then finally, you're going to adjust your intensity if you feel necessary. Most of the time on my deloads, I'll pull back my intensity on my main movements slightly, and then I keep my accessories pretty much the same. And this works really well for myself. And folks, that's the end of Deload Talk. So hopefully you found this beneficial. If you liked this video, let me know down in the comments. Hit that like button. Give me some feedback if you'd like more videos like this. If there's specific topics you'd like, drop it down in the comments. And otherwise, catch you next time.